WMCT-TV, Channel 30, Marlborough.
To welcome everybody here to the Marlborough Public Library. This is the visiting author that we've been able to get for the young adult department. The program will also include the drawing for the summer reading raffle prizes. I've had the privilege of talking a few times with this author who has been able to take his writing and put it in a published form. And we have a couple of his books here in the library. He will also, have some here to sign. It's always nice to get an author signing your autographed book that you own yourself. But if you'd like to borrow the books here, the Curious Naturalist is in our young adult department. And as you know, I'm the young adult librarian, Susan Alatalo, the librarian we have for the middle school and the high school age group. A very special group, as I'm sure you'll agree, and worthy of special attention. The Curious Naturalist was a newsletter that I used to get as a child, and it's published by the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And our author this evening is the Director of Publications at the Massachusetts Audubon Society. Unfortunately, the Curious Naturalist isn't published anymore, but a more mature version for older people is now in existence. And this is called Sanctuary Magazine. The library has this. And the editor of this magazine is our author tonight, John Mitchell. The library, as you know, has a free museum pass to visit all 18 Massachusetts Audubon Society sanctuaries. So if you want to visit Drummond Farm or many of the other sanctuaries in the whole state of Massachusetts, you can borrow our museum pass from the adult department upstairs, and then you can drop in and visit. There's a library there at the Drummond Farm, which is where Mr. Mitchell works, and that's also a place that has a nature trail, and it's a place where you walk along and everything is labeled so you can help identify growing natural things. And I understand that the Girl Scouts in Marlborough are working on a project to do, are any of you involved in doing a nature trail for that? That's wonderful. Maybe you'd like to discuss that after the talk with the author. He will be available for questions and answers later on. So I hope you take advantage of picking his brain. And we're also pleased that we have someone here who's written a lot about history, because in the high school this year for the summer reading list, the history department collaborated with the English department to construct their list. And I wouldn't say that history is the only subject that's included in Mr. Mitchell's work. There's a lot of that nature and science and myth and good storytelling, and I hope you all have a chance to read his work. I'd like to thank the Friends of the Marlborough Public Library for helping us bring this program here. Without their generosity, we would not be able to have this type of program. And the Friends of the Library are people who just support the public library. They're not employees of the library. They don't, have a salary from it, but they make possible these extra pluses, such as having a visiting author come to our area. And one more thing I'd like to say is Littleton is north of here on 495, Route 495. And that's an area where I hung out a lot as a child, too. And the place where I went was on a pond where my grandparents helped start a club for the Finnish ethnic group. And there's always just something really special about that place, even though all those older people have gone away, and this relates to Mr. Mitchell's book, Ceremonial Time. I'm sure he can relate. So, without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Mitchell.
Well, thank you very much. Would somebody keep track of time for me? That you know, when you want this to be over, just give me a sign, because I could go on. I could go on for hours about these different subjects. I just want to tell you that actually The Curious Naturalist is no longer published as a magazine, but it was reborn in this one. There's a page of this publication, which is called Sanctuary. There's a page entitled The Curious Naturalist, which is very similar to that book. And I suppose if you took all the pages from this magazine, which has been out for about 10 years, and put them together, that would be almost another Curious Naturalist. So maybe we should do that someday. Another thing about the Curious Naturalist is that the one that you used to know, the old Curious Naturalist, used to deal with a single theme every issue. Is that right?
Yes.
Is it the one you used to see?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, this magazine here, Sanctuary, which I started about 10 years ago, also deals with a single theme every issue. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, as they say. Well, I want to just tell you about these two or three books, and you know, sort of how they evolved, and tell you a few stories from them, and then if you have any questions, I think this is such a small group that if you have any questions right in the while I'm talking, just raise your hand, because this, you know, I gather a fairly informal gathering. Let's see. I just want to say what I did with this first book here, which was published in 1984. It's called Ceremonial Time, and what it is it's a history of a single square mile of land, and it just happens to be a square mile of land here in Massachusetts. It just happens to be Littleton, which is not too far north of here. And the reason it happens to be there is because I live there. And so that's the area that I started to explore when I first moved to these parts about 15 years ago. And it became the area that I knew best, and I thought I would like to write about it. I like to walk, is how it got started. It's, you know, when I first moved there, there still are two working farms in the area, but there were 5 when I first came. And there was also woods and fields. And so I used to go out and just walk around, look at things, and I would see stone walls in the woods. And of course, stone walls mark where fields once were located. And yet these stone walls were in the middle of the dark woods, so it was obvious that the land had changed a little. And I got interested in, you know, who had built those walls, and how long ago had those fields been abandoned. And the more I looked into it, the longer this history of this area, or the longer I realized people had been living in this particular region. Concord, as you may know, was the first inland settlement in this country. And Littleton is, and probably not Marlborough. I don't know the history of Marlborough, but probably not too much. When was Marlborough founded? Does anybody know? 16 what? 60. The what's Concord? 1637, I think. And Littleton is 1657. So it's not too, you know, it's about the same period of time. And I don't know who settled Marlborough, but I suspect it was people from Concord moving west. And the people who settled in Concord had come from Kent in England. And Kent, England, is the fruit-growing district of England. It's where they grow apples and cherries and pears. And so here we have, in 1990, in Littleton, in the Neshoba Valley, the fruit growing district. It's a legacy that has lasted for over 300 years. So anyway, I started researching these people who had settled in this area. And I learned that, as you all know, that these people from Kent were not the first people to live in the Littleton region. And I learned that there had been, in fact, in 1660, a Christian Indian village right in Littleton called Neshoba Plantation. And I think there was one here in Marlborough. Is that right? Does anybody know? Was there one? There were 16 villages, and I think, do you know the name of it? I think there was one in Newton, there was one in Littleton, there was one, I knew it was around here someplace. Holliston, I think, had one. Martha's Vineyard had one. Natick had a big one, and so on. There were several. There were 16 all told. And these Christian Indian villages were founded by a man named John Eliot, who came over to this country. He was a Puritan minister, and he came over to this country, and he actually believed, unlike most of the other Puritans, he believed that the Indians were capable of salvation. Now, a lot of the Puritans didn't think that. They thought the Indians were akin to animals. They were not intelligent enough or not worthy enough to be saved, so to speak. Or, I put that in quotes, saved. And Eliot, thought they were capable of conversion, and so he established these villages for them, and he made it possible that the land would be granted outright to the Indians. Well, there was one of these Indian plantations, one of these villages, Christian Indian villages, right across the road from the house where I was living. It was called Neshoba Plantation. And I got interested in who were the people who were living in that village. And I learned, they called them Neshoba Indians, but in fact that's just a word that the English made up. They were probably Pawtucket Indians. And then I learned that I wondered who are the Pawtuckets, what's their history? And I learned that they had been living in the region around Littleton and Marlborough for about 3,000 years. And I learned further that they had, I got interested in how these Indians evolved, and I learned that the Pawtucket Indians were part of a larger group called the Algonquin, or the Eastern Woodland Indians. And they had come from a group known as the Archaic people, and the Archaic people had evolved from a group known as the Paleo Indians. The Paleo Indians are like, what you read about cavemen. That's what these were. They carried, the Paleo Indians they didn't even have bows and arrows. They carried spears and clubs, and they dressed in furs, and they hunted woolly mammoths, huge elephant-like creatures with long trunks and long very red woolly fur, woolly hair, very long and silky. So I started adding up all these years, the Paleo Indians, the Archaic Indians, the Eastern Woodland Indians, and then this very short 300-year history of the Europeans here, and it turned out to be 15,000 years. And 15,000 years ago, there were no human beings. Well, 16,000 years ago, there were no human beings here. And anybody know why? Ice. This region, right where you're sitting, if you had been sitting in this spot 16,000 years ago, you would have been sitting underneath a mile of ice, the glacier, the huge, massive glacier which had come down throughout New England, all the way down to New York area, 3 times in the last 60,000 years. And 16,000 years ago, the last of these 3 advances was on its way out. It was sort of drawing back to the north. So there really is no human history here. before 15,000 years ago. But as soon as the ice started to draw back, woolly mammoths and barren ground caribou and beavers the size of the piano, huge, immense beavers. Yes, immense beavers. And wolves, dire wolves, huge, this high. Wolves this high could run for days on end chasing these woolly mammoths. Saber-toothed tigers, do you know what they look like? Teeth this long. It was right here in Marlborough. All these animals. Yeah. They are still here, in fact. They are. In Harvard, Massachusetts, they dug up a woolly mammoth back in 1850s. They're still here. They're, it's just when will we find them? And as soon as the ice withdrew, these animals, followed the ice, and of course, following the animals came the Paleo-Indians. So that's a history of. If anybody says to you, to tell briefly the history of the United States, or history of North America, you have to begin with the beginning. Our time here, we're all European extraction here, looks like, and our time here, in some cases, only one generation, in other cases, the so-called colonial, people, 300 years, it's nothing. It's nothing. 3,000 years, maybe you can begin to have some identification with the land or with the place. But so anyway, we are all sojourners here. We're just passing through. In any case, I became, the more I learned about this single square mile, the more interested I became in it, and I decided to put all these ideas together in a book. Now, how do you write a history of a 15,000-year history of a single square mile when you actually only have records for 300 years? As I have said in here, I think that I got the people who lived in Littleton area were obsessed with record keeping. They had great tax records, and they had records of who lived where and what land, and so it's very easy for me to dig out the time between 1980 and 1680 or 1660. That was easy, and that left me only 14,700 years to research with no with no documents. Now, the fact is, however, there were records, as I learned, and those records, number one, there were people here, as you know, and number two, some of those people are still around. There are very few, in fact, only 3 Pawtucket Indians left in this region. But there are a lot of Indians, there are a lot of native people who are here, whose people were here in the New England area, and so I started interviewing them, and I started talking about them, and I started collecting their folk tales. Now, I want to tell you a story about Marlborough, I think. After the glacier withdrew, there was a huge amount of ice, of course, and when the ice melted, there was a lot of water on the land. So that meant, there were a lot of lakes around, a lot of lakes and rivers, and the ocean levels were much higher than they are today. Well, someplace around here, someplace around Marlborough, between some low-lying hills, geez, I'm knocking this pen down, there was sort of a dam created by ice and rocks and pebbles, and the ice dam created a huge lake. And at one point in history, that ice dam broke, and the lake flooded. And then you had the land you see today was, emerged from underwater. Well, I learned a story from some of the people that I interviewed, some of the Native American people. One of the stories had to do with a thing called the frog monster. And what happened was a huge, well, Frog had created this lake for himself to live in, and he was, he was huge, a giant frog, and he was eating the people who lived around the lake. And so the people were very disturbed by this, and they called for help. They called to the Chimanatu, who was the great creator, or the maker, and they asked him for help, and he sent a being called Glooskap, who was sort of a spirit being who could change himself into various animals, and he could swim up streams and underwater. And he lived as a bear, and he could fly, and he was a whale for a while. I mean, he was one of these magic guys that you find in folk tales. Well, Glooskap came into the country around here to catch the frog monster, and he set up his he started to live in a cave on the west side of this lake. Well, Frog Monster got word that Glooskap was after him, and he went and he knew where he lived. So the frog went and set up in this cave. He hid himself inside the cave, and Glooskap came home one night, and he had a sense that something was wrong. So he called out to his cave, and he said, "Hello, cave, I'm home. How are you?" And the cave, of course, didn't answer. And he said it again, and the cave didn't answer. And he said a third time, he said, "Hello, cave, is everything all right? That's strange. Usually you answer me." And so the frog called out, "Yes, everything's fine. Do come in." Well, Glooskap knew Frog was in there, so he rolled a huge rock in front of the cave. And then he went to Bear, who lived on the other side of the lake. And he said to Bear, "Listen, Bear was causing trouble too with the people." He said, "I've caught a lot of people, and I've trapped them in a cave over on the west side of the lake. If you would like to eat them, you have but to go there and roll the rock aside." So the bear went over to the west side of the lake. He rolled the rock aside. Tongue came out, from the frog. Big battle. These are two giant beasts, by the way, mythic animals. Well, they killed each other in the end, but the battle was so huge it shook the earth. And the shaking of the earth broke the impoundments that the frog had made, and the lake that he had made drained off. Well, when I heard that story, it had a very familiar ring to me, and I realized that what I was hearing was essentially the same story I'd read in the geology texts. The impoundments broke, and the lake drained. The only difference is that the Indians had tell history in terms of folklore, whereas we scientifically minded Europeans tell the story in terms of science. But it's the same story. So after that, I started paying much more attention to what the folk tales were saying, and they don't all reflect the geography, but some of them are actually quite significant. And there are a lot of them seemingly concentrated around this one area not far from where I live. In fact, right behind my house, there was a hemlock grove. And in that grove, I studied these trees, and I learned these trees are actually about 250 years old. And then I dug out this story of, from my Pawtucket sources, of a shaman, a medicine man, who could live as a bear or a human being, either one. And he could live forever. He chose to either live as a bear. They say, they told me he's still around, actually, although I don't know what form he's living in right now. But anyway, there was, living right in back of where I live, there were a couple of freed slaves living in 1811, a man named Johnny Putnam. Now, the last bear in this whole region was killed in about 1757, and Johnny Putnam was living on this ridge behind where I now live in the woods back there, and one night his dog started making a lot of noise and scratched the door, so he let it in, and it spent the night under the bed quivering. And in the morning, when it was December, light snow during the night, and in the morning when Johnny Putnam went out, he saw tracks going around the house a couple of times. So he followed the tracks. Big animal. Didn't know what it was. He followed the tracks, and they went down the hill behind this ridge where Johnny Putnam lived, and then they went, sort of circled a barn where there were a couple of ox and some cows, and then it came back up the ridge, and Putnam got this man, Joel Proctor, who had a gun. They tracked the animal to the hemlock grove. And they went into the grove, and they didn't see anything, but they didn't see the tracks going out on the other side, so they figured it must be in there. Johnny Putnam sat down against a tree to have a smoke, and the other guy, Proctor, looked up, and he saw a huge bear right above Johnny Putnam. So he shot the bear. Big, monstrous bear. Fell out of the tree, landed right on top of this black man. And they rolled it aside, and Joel Proctor went back to his farm to get an ox to haul the bear's body away. Well, while he was gone, the bear jumped up. And the bear started circling around in this hemlock grove, knocking itself into trees and growling, and blood was streaming out of its mouth, and it was screaming. It was just the most horrible thing Johnny Putnam recorded, that he had ever seen in his life. Then after, and then it started to cry like a human being, he said, and then it went and sat right upright and died sitting up. Well, Johnny Putnam went into shock after this, and the War of 1812 came along. He went off in the war, and he didn't come back for a few years, and when he came back, he didn't, he couldn't speak, and he lived alone for the rest of his life out on the ridge. But on his deathbed, the day he died, he told another person in the Proctor family that it wasn't a bear that had died that day in the hemlock grove. He said it was a man. Just before it died, it turned into a man. Well, that is sound. Now, Johnny Putnam didn't know the legend of the Pawtucket shaman who could live as a bear. And of course, nobody in the history who wrote the history of Littleton, the people where I got this story, they didn't know it either. I put the two together. And I don't know whether it was I just know that Johnny Putnam's story matches very closely the Pawtucket legend, which had more or less died out 300 years earlier. So these are the kind of stories, that I started to collect around there. And the reason I was smiling when you mentioned that lake in Littleton, when Susan mentioned the lake, is that's the part of Littleton that used to be called Hog End. And there was I'm going to forget her name now, Goody Bradshaw, I think. There was a woman who lived down there who lived to be very, very old. She lived down near that lake. And up on this scratch flat, this single square mile of land that I was writing about was called Scratch Flat. And there were two girls who lived up there who started acting in 1720, and these two girls started acting very strange. They would climb up on barn roofs, and they would find them out sitting in the middle of farm ponds, and they claimed that birds were flying into their house, and in short, they seemed bewitched. And so when they were questioned about this, they said, yes, Mrs. Dudley is a witch. Mrs. Dudley was this very innocent woman who was the wife, in fact, of the local minister, and all Mrs. Dudley did was she liked to come over to Scratch Flat and collect birds' eggs and bright little stones, and she liked, she liked nature. Well, these two girls accused Mrs. Dudley of being a witch, and they weren't quick to prosecute because this was not too long after the Salem witch trials, and they didn't want to go overboard again. But one day the girls started screaming fanatically about that Mrs. Dudley had come flying into the room, and the mother had a knife in her hand, and they said, "Kill the witch, kill Mrs. Dudley." Well, we couldn't see anything, but the mother, just to appease the girls, started going like that. And at about that very same time, poor Mrs. Dudley died in town of a miscarriage. This is in the town histories. You'll find this story in the town histories. Well, Mrs. Dudley seems to be fairly innocent in all this, but there was this Goody Bradshaw, or Bartlett, I guess, Goody Bartlett, who lived down in the section of Hog End, who seemed to be living comfortably for a very, very, very long time. In fact, she may have lived to be 103 years old or something like that. And the implications were in this story that it wasn't Mrs. Dudley. If there was a witch, it wasn't Mrs. Dudley. It was Goody Bartlett down in the section known as Hog End. Now, I wanted to tell you about so this is a section of land that I live in and still live there. And I wrote this book published in 1984, and there had been some changes coming to the town when I first started to write about it, and then they seemed to get worse. And I also felt that I was not quite getting to know the land as well as I could. At least after this book was published, I was sort of disassociated from it. So I in 1986, I think, I built a little cottage on the ridge, on this same ridge, even closer to this mysterious hemlock grove, and I set up housekeeping there. And this is quite apart from roads or any traffic or lights, and I lived there alone, without running water, without electricity, and I heated the place with wood, and I just I'd stay back there and look at nature and study birds and study the forest and the changes of the seasons, and I read books and I read journals, and just took the time to think. I lived apart. Now, does this sound familiar to you? A certain party named Henry Thoreau did the same thing by Walden Pond 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And I had a strange coincidence. The day almost, I think the very week at least, that I moved into this cottage, somebody gave me the full set of journals of Henry Thoreau. He was an inveterate journal keeper. He wrote every day, sometimes, pages and pages in his journal. And he died at 45, but I mean, he started, that's 20, 30 years of journal keeping. And, the volume of his, it's over 2 million words. The shelf alone of his journals is this wide. I think there are 11 volumes, 11 books, and all his journals. And so when I moved into the cottage, somebody gave me these journals, and, I'd already read some Thoreau, and I thought, gee, this is it. This is perfect. I meant to read these. So I started, what I would do, they are they're heavy reading. This is 19th century prose and I would go by the day. If it was April 12th, I would read the entries in various journals for April 12th. And on April 13th, I'd read a few for April 13th. So that way I went through a whole year of his, you know, of course he was dealing with different years. But now about the same time that I moved into the cottage, have any of you ever driven up 495? You go up to Maine on 495, or you go north, and you see that Littleton exit. Oh, and you know, the second Littleton exit says Littleton Common, I think, and right on the right, as you go just beyond the exit sign for Littleton, an immense low-lying building, and that is a plant for the Digital Corporation, and it's huge. I mean, it looks like a big cathedral up there. And that plant was built at the same time I built my cottage, or same time they had been working on it for years, but they completed it about the same time I completed my place. So I got very interested in, you know, the comparison between my life, which I actually purposely chose to live without running water, without electricity. I mean, that was the idea of that, was to, you know, see what it's like to live now in our time, in the 20th century. Well, let's just say in 20th century America, because most people in the world live without electricity, without running water, and without central heat. So this was just an experiment that I did to sort of see, to put things in perspective. But I found it ironic that, you know, at the same time that I was living this simple way of life, reading Thoreau, this big computer company was putting up a plant. Now, it's really just a mile away. I could see the lights on winter nights. You could look out across and see the glow. They left their lights on all night long. You know. So I sort of put these together, these ideas, you know. Thoreau's life, I got very interested in how, you know, why did he go to the cabin? What was his life all about? My daily life, and sort of the life of the ridge where I was living, the natural history on the ridge, and the plants and the animals and the people. There were some people living over there too, farmers and that sort. And the way of life at the digital plant. And I put these all together in this book called Living at the End of Time. These two books deal with a single square mile. They're both, they both, you know, are treating the same place. I mean, we haven't, and yet, you know, I could probably write another book about it if I were so inclined. In any case, this, what interested me, not so much, I mean, you know, my life and everything and digital was very interesting, but what interested me was Henry Thoreau's way of life in Concord, because it was so much of what he was doing. And are you reading, are these the people that read Thoreau, or is that?
Anyone read Thoreau in here?
Or was that another group?
The high school, yeah.
Mm. Well, anyway, you know the story. You know the story. Everybody does in Massachusetts, I think. He went to Walden Pond. He lived alone in a cottage, and this was, you know, unheard of in his time. And he wrote his thoughts, and he after 2 years he went back and he lived in Concord. And there's never been another book like Walden, as far as I know. I mean, there are plenty of books like Walden, but there's never one that really did it all. He wrote about economy. He wrote, you know, what his life was like at that, why he did it, you know, and how much it cost, and, you know, every detail of what he ate and that sort of thing. It's a great work of on the economics of living frugally. It's also a great work of natural history. There's no book that is so thorough an account of a singular place as Walden. He covers everything. It's also a great work of philosophy, the philosophy of solitude. It's a great work of mysticism. You know, he was on a mystic quest. He was trying to recapture some, you know, the sort of the spiritual experiences that he had had in his youth. It's a great document. But why would he do it? Why would this man who, you know, he lived a normal life in Concord, what would make him go out and live alone by it was highly irregular. Everybody in the town thought he was crazy, eccentric. They still do. I mean, people in Concord, you know, the tradition of Henry Thoreau, the eccentric, and Henry Thoreau, the sort of the drunk and or the crazy man. I mean, they have all sorts of theories. But in fact, he was on this quest to understand. He said, I wanted to live. I went to the woods because I wanted to live close to the bone. I wanted to understand. You know, I wanted to be able to say that I had been alive, so that when I came to die, I could say that I had lived deliberately. I lived with some purpose, and he just wanted to sort everything out, and so that was his purpose, and he, you know, put all this down. But he did have, driving him there to the pond, he had some personal experiences, and one of the key ones of which was his relationship to his brother. He was very close. He had a brother named John, and he was very close with his brother John. And about 2 years before he went to, 3 years before he went to Walden Pond, John was shaving, and he, you know, he had a straight razor, and he nicked his little finger with the razor, like that. It's nothing. I mean, just a cut, and he didn't think it was so minor. He didn't think anything of it. He just bound it up in a cloth, you know, and went. He was a school teacher. He went to work, and on the way home, about 2 days later, he got these pains in his arm and in his muscles, and he barely made it home. It hurt so much. His muscles were so stiff and tight, and he went right to bed. They called the doctor. The doctor looked at his hand, and it was all swollen, and he said, "You've got lockjaw." No one survived lockjaw in those days. I'm not sure they do now, unless you catch it early. That's why you get tetanus shot. You can keep up on your tetanus shots, so this won't happen to you. Whatever. Anyway, poor John, for a week, you know, he was delirious, and Henry Thoreau, who was very close to him, sat next to his bed the whole time, one whole week, sitting there, watching his brother die. It was a horrible, horrible experience. And the week after his brother died, I mean, Henry went and took care of everything. He was very, you know, good about it. But 1 week later, he got lockjaw himself. He had aching muscles. He went to bed. He was totally sick. He couldn't move. They called the doctor, and he said, "Well, sure, it looks like lockjaw, but I don't see why. He didn't cut himself. There's no reason." Well, what it was a sympathetic illness. Psychosomatic. He caught his brother's disease. He was so close to his brother, and it took him. He did recover, obviously, but it took him all that winter to recover. It wasn't lockjaw. It was just you know, he was in sympathy with his brother. Well, this death of his brother was a major turning point in his life, and he had been writing before that, and was not successful. And he was working. His father had a pencil factory, and he was not. Henry helped greatly in the pencil factory, but he didn't care about making pencils. So he really sort of had no direction. And he figured the only thing that he could do to really sort of put this all together was to get himself apart, get himself away from the daily life, and get himself time to think, time to put all this stuff together. And so that's what he did, and that's why he went to Walden. And the book Walden is, and what it is an account of in fact, while he was at Walden, at the pond, he wrote a book about. He and his brother once took a boat trip from Concord all the way up to the White Mountains. They went on the Concord River and then up the Merrimack River. And while he was living in Concord, in Walden, he wrote the account of that journey with his brother. It was sort of a memorial to his brother. And he also kept his journals. And after he came out of Walden, he put the journals of the 2 years together into the book Walden. And that, shortly after his death, he never knew Walden was going to be a book that has read and has been translated into virtually every civilized language. It's a book that has influenced Gandhi. It's a book that influenced the British Labour Party. It's a book that influenced Martin Luther King. It's a book it's one of the most influential books in Western civilization. He had no idea. It hardly sold anything while he was alive. Only after he died did it start to take off. But in any case, I guess my main point is that all this has sprung, for me, has all sprung from looking at one single square mile of land. And so if you're interested in writing, or if you're interested in journal keeping, or natural history, or ideas, or almost history, almost anything, my point is, I guess, is that it's not necessary to outfit a major expedition and leave Marlborough. Believe it or not, it's all right here if you can take the time to dig deeper into what's going on here, and take a deep look at the way that life works. Questions? Yes.
Are you writing more books?
Yeah, I am. I've got several in the works. One is a piece of fiction about some of the characters that appear in here. In particular, this Mrs. Dudley, who was a very interesting character. But also that's a long way off, probably, to publication. But more to the point, I am writing a book about the sense of place, which is your understanding of a region, or your associations with a spot, which I obviously seem to be getting with this scratch flat area. So I've learned that this idea of a sense of place, it doesn't exist in this country, but it does in other parts of the world. And in fact, it's a very, very strong association. Your way you think about the town that you're from, or the place that you're from, or the region, or the valley, or the river valley that you're from. In other countries, in other parts of the world, throughout history, that was a very important part of who you were. It's not in this country. Well, the reason it interests me, because if you have this strong association with a place, and people come in to destroy the place, either through development or war or however, you're going to work to save it. And that's sort of the bottom of environmental, the bottom line of environmentalism, which is what I do for a living. So that's why I'm interested in the sense of place. Any other questions? Yes?
I was wondering, in your book, Ceremonial Time, you've got this story, this happened, then someone told you this. Now, how do you get that all connected? How do you collect it and keep track of it, and then decide, in my final book, I'm going to keep it like this? Like, do you have files
when you go to write it. How do I do that?
Do you use a computer?
No. I guess I just have a good memory, for one thing, and so I have all those stories. I may take notes. I do take notes. I go and talk to these people, and I take notes, knowing that I'm going to write a book, but I don't know what the way you do books in nowadays, in nonfiction at least, is you generally write one chapter, and you do sort of an outline of each chapter, but really general. Really, really simple. or you might write a synopsis of the book, and then you give that to a publisher, because you don't write the whole book. You can write the whole book, but if they never publish it, you've wasted your time. So people nowadays tend to just write part of the book and outline it. And so that's what I had done, I suppose, with this. So when I was collecting the stories, I knew generally where they were going to go, and then when I sat down to write the book was entirely different from the outline anyway. But I knew I had taken notes, so I knew I knew the stories, and I guess I'm pretty disorganized. I did have to look for them again, maybe, but they all evolved, you know. And also, it's an interesting thing, Annie Dillard. Do you know the writer Annie Dillard? Has anybody heard of her? She said, when you start working on a book, such as this book here, Living at the End of Time, which is an account of a single year in this house, things happen all of a sudden. It's like the book is already there. You start to write it, and then almost everything that goes on around you fits into the book somehow. So while you're writing it, things happen that work, that fit. And so that's how I do it. Yeah.
What made you want to start writing books? What inspired you?
Well, that's a very good question, actually. I think what happened was, where I grew up with, I grew up with my father was older than, he was an old man when I was born. He was almost 50 when I was born. And he liked to hold forth and tell stories, and we didn't have a TV when I grew up. And he would make us sit down at dinner, and then he would tell stories, and he'd go on and on, and my mother too. They talked and they told stories. And my father was also a journal keeper. He kept it, my father lived in China for 3 years, and he kept journal all his life, but he kept Journal of China, which I had read while I was living in this cabin. But anyway, I never thought I hated these stories. They were very... Oh, and also I'll tell you another thing about, got me probably influenced, is my family comes from a place called the Eastern Shore of Maryland, where is sort of a very rural district, and they don't seem to, at least when I was growing up, all they did was sit around on porches and tell stories and talk. And I hated it. It was very boring. They'd make me sit there, and I'd have to listen to this long, slow southern stories about dogs and cows and who did this and blah, blah, blah. It was so boring. But, I think that's why I got to be a writer, hearing those stories and seeing life as metaphor, kind of, seeing life in perspective, in taking broader view of stories, and if somebody meet some crazy guy on the street, most people want to go the other way. Well, for me, if I meet some crazy guy on the street, I'm willing to talk to him and hear what he's got to say, and I think that's what writers do. They're open to. And I probably learned that from knowing the value of stories. I think that's it. That's it? Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Any advice for young writers, what they should work on in order to start preparing for...
Well, now, is that what you are, young writers?
Some of them are aspiring, I think.
Oh, yeah?
Creative writing is the Girl Scout badge that some of them are working on.
You've probably been told that, right?